Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to Deep Dialogues. And I'm thrilled to have this very winsome gentleman sitting in front of us who has some remarkable information that he's going to be sharing with you. As you see, his name is Dan Waits, and the title of our exposition, our Deep Dialogue, is When the Heavens Meet, Heaven and Earth Meet. And ladies and gentlemen, you've become accustomed to the nature of the causative nature of these dialogues, that it really is based on the level of vibration that is emitted through deep causative conversation. So be prepared for the fact that we will be exchanging, and that although this is a teaching or educative platform, it's really about how we engage, meaning the dear one who comes and engages with me, how we engage in really, really deep, resonant, meaningful energies that happen in the combustibility of the extemporized moment, as we move forward and just move on impulse. So Dan and I have a few ideas about what we'd love to share, but we don't know where this is going. And this is the first time that we've met. Although I feel as though I know him, because Dan is a consulting astrologer, a writer, and is gradually developing into a major content creator on social media platforms like YouTube. And he focuses on the natal and events astrology. So we'll give you details later about how you can reach him, because you'll see as soon as he starts conversing with me that he has some very remarkable insights to provide us with, an ability of being really perspicacious, of really going deeply into the center of what the issue is that we may be exploring as a development of our own consciousness at this time. And Dan's goal is to use the science of astrological wisdom coupled with fascinating historical research to understand the galvanizing times in which we live, and so to help us all cross the threshold between the mundane and the magical nature of the cosmos. Dan Waits, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Stewart. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Bless you. I am as well, because I really do feel the credence of your integrity. So it's really great to have you here. Tell us where it all began, your fascination with the stars.
It's a really long story, I'd say, but you have to start somewhere. And I would probably take it back to around 2016, when I found myself living in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is a really interesting place, and a place where people have a very different mentality and way of seeing the world to what you tend to see in England, which is where I grew up and where I'm guessing you grew up as well, Stewart. People see the world completely differently, and it's a place where magic is completely real. And I'd spent many years living in East Asia and then in Papua New Guinea, and I'd met a lot of people who had a completely different mentality, to whom spirit was completely real. And the standard sort of arrogant Western attitude often is, well, those people are deluded, and actually you can explain everything with materialist science and so forth. And there's only so long that I could hold that way of seeing things before gradually I just began to become much more open to the reality of spirit and to, let's say, other ways of knowing and seeing. So this would kind of transform my mentality a little bit, and I became quite obsessed with the question of whether magic was real or not. And in 2018, I found myself living in Ukraine, and I was not in a great place at that time. And this question started to really bug me. And I ended up deciding to do an online course in magic, not of the kind of stagecraft variety, but of the kind of magic that occult practitioners do. And the teacher that I was learning from quite early on told you that you should learn some astrology, because if you want to do magic, you should have some idea of what your true will is. What do you really want? Who are you? There's no point in practicing that art without having some idea of why you're doing it and what you want to achieve with it. And you need some deep understanding. I didn't end up becoming much of a magician, to be honest, but I started into astrology at that time. And I'd never really gotten into it before. I didn't really know much about it. But what I was struck by just learning to read charts at that time is that it just seemed to work a bit too well. The things that my own chart was saying about me seemed to be a little too on the nose than what you would expect if it was all just kind of random and confirmation bias and all that kind of thing. And I started to see, yes, I think maybe there is something to this, and got more and more into it, was reading an awful lot about it, learning to read charts and so forth. One thing that I remember very clearly, though, this was in 2018, is that a lot of astrologers were talking about 2020 at that time. They were writing about a big pile-up of planets that was coming that year and making some pretty strong statements about what was going to come that year. They were talking about a great transformation, a societal reset, great world crisis, all this kind of thing. And I remember thinking at the time, that sounds quite scary, actually, and I'm not sure if I'm quite ready for that. Maybe we can put this stuff back in the box and not do the global crisis and so forth. And I kind of sort of drifted a little bit away from astrology until 2020 rolled around. And I think it was about maybe March of that year, and something just struck me, and I was like, hang on, the astrologers said this was going to happen. And at that moment, I realized that I needed to take this thing 100% seriously, because if astrologers were able to predict something of this kind happening, to me, it just I felt very viscerally that there is really something to this. And for me, it was like, why wouldn't you be obsessed with this subject if it can do these things, if it can describe history and world events and tell you so much about yourself? So that's really my story. And it does, like many people, 2020 was big for the story.
Yeah. And geographically, where were you when the reality hit in 2020?
I was in Jerusalem, actually. I was living not too far from the old city of Jerusalem. And before that, a few months before, I'd been living on the Mount of Olives, actually. So I was in this very holy city that's charged with a lot of energy. I don't know if you've been or spent much time there.
I know it well, yes. I've spent a lot of time there, and recently just worked in Gaza for the UN as a helping aid workers recover from the super stress that they've been under, the war trauma and the PTSD. So yes, extraordinary energy.
Well, I was actually there as an aid worker, and I visited Gaza many times.
Yeah,
that was why I was there. Obviously, it was a little before what's happened since then, and I came out without the kind of trauma that I imagine some people have been hit with. But
Yeah, that's a huge story, which of course is in the forefront of our consciousness. And hopefully, we can come back to that, because, I know that you have this. I just wanted to address the point that I was sort of teasing out of our conversation. It's unusual to meet someone who has traveled so expansively as you have. And the way that you speak of it is quite effortless. We know that our dear American friends who live on that vast continent travel very easily, but we Europeans tend to be very Eurocentric. And so the very fact that I was in Papua New Guinea and then I was in you deal with it in a very deft way. And I know it obviously had great meaning for you. But what's fascinating, if I may draw the parallel, is the way that you now read the heavens. You read the cartography of the heavens, specifically through astrological vibration, and what the far-reaching nature of the astronomy, and how it's a conscious living substance that is growing all the time, expanding and contracting. And yet I wondered what the interconnectivity was between the way you read the heavens and the way that you needed to travel around the planet. Was at the moment you're in Thailand.
That's right. Yes, and I lived here for quite a few years as well. So I've spent a long time in East Asia, and I spent a long time working in the humanitarian industry. And that's how I ended up in some of these places in Papua, in Israel, and so forth. And it was I feel now that it was all kind of preparation for what I do now.
Yeah.
I think that's quite a common sentiment, that when you kind of have some sort of spiritual awakening, you realize why you went through some of the things that you went through. And one of the things that's relevant, I think, is that I was working for a humanitarian organization, a neutral humanitarian organization in war zones and in places affected by violence, which Papua New Guinea is. And one of the things that we needed to do is be able to kind of analyze the situation from a somewhat sort of neutral perspective. You have it was a neutral humanitarian organization, and you have to be able to sort of work on both sides of the line and so forth. And I think it kind of gave me some practice with trying to sort of see things from above and see different perspectives. And I think that is one of the things that astrology, or to do events astrology, as you call it, or world astrology, one of the skills that you need, I would say, is an ability to kind of step back a little bit and almost take, and this is going to sound a bit grandiose, and I don't mean it in a particularly grandiose way, but the God's eye view, kind of what are the gods sort of doing here, and what are them, how are both sides, all sides, being motivated by the archetypal energies that we feel, rather than being too sucked into the kind of human dramas that we see all around us in the world at the moment.
Well, you're very rare on that level, in my experience of being an awakened, fascinated visitor into astrology for, I've been spiritually awake for many, many, many years, having been awoken as a child, seeing spirit as a child. It was interrupted during adolescence, but as a young actor, I had out-of-body experiences in the early 70s, and that really tuned me back in. And then people kept saying to me, you have the most extraordinary intuition, because I would say things. So I gained some interesting training at the College of Psychic Studies here in London. And then, of course, I met the angels in 1987, and that was a sort of mind-blowing experience. However, back to what you were saying. So this is what's so wonderful about the way that you address our lives from a macro point of view, to experience a way of interpreting the micro signals that take place as a result of what many people consider to be unconscious behavior. But of course, the interface between the heavens and the earth allow us to see, maybe not prior to, but when we're reflecting on the post-operative, as it were, when we're reflecting on the whole of what's taken place, because we're fascinated in determining what the values are and how they impinge on our lives. There's something very extraordinary in your insight. And at the moment, of course, we know that there is something very huge that is taking place within our region of the cosmos, within this galaxy. And I know you're particularly interested in it because we have this celestial visitor that is passing through our galaxy that is referred to as being 3i Atlas. And was that a surprise to you, or was that also predictive in the sense of something huge is taking place?
It's a really interesting question. I couldn't say honestly that I predicted the coming of another interstellar visitor. However, one of the things that I've been looking at in my astrology, in my study of big cycles, is what you could call the UFO phenomenon. And I see this really as humanity's encounter with the other, and is really about the understanding that there are other intelligent beings beyond us, all around us, and in the cosmos that we live in. And this is something that we've spent a few hundred years kind of denying is true. And we're in a point of time now where we're coming to terms with this reality once more, but from the place that we've been, from this place of having developed the scientific methods and the transformations that's wrought on the world. So I've been following that issue quite a lot, and I have been expecting a big opening on that subject over the next couple of years, 25 to 2027. And what's interesting about Three Eye Atlas, well, there are many interesting things about it, as I'm sure you've been talking about it yourself. But one thing that I did take notice of is that the first interstellar object that we detected, Oumuamua, which arrived I think was detected in October of 2017. We'd never detected one of these objects from outside the solar system before. And this was seemingly a strange object. It was never really resolved. Obviously, the Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb had a lot to say about it, and he was pointing out that it seems to have accelerated in a strange way as it was, or more than you would expect as it was leaving the solar system and so forth. And it was strangely shaped and all of these kinds of things. But what was interesting to me is that we have this interstellar object. And as an astrologer, you have to see things as symbolic, as above, so below. What is in the celestial sphere is symbolic of what's going on in the Earth, on the Earth. And so we have this interstellar object. This object from outside comes into our kind of mind space. And I believe it was December of 2017, so just a couple of months after Oumuamua was detected, you have this story appearing on the front page of the New York Times about UFOs and about how the Pentagon supposedly been investigating UFOs. And this was quite a milestone because you wouldn't see a story like that on the front page of the New York Times. The whole subject has been treated as a kind of joke. It's been ignored and denied and ridiculed for a very long time. And that's really been the policy of the governments and militaries and intelligence agencies and so forth. However, suddenly you have this story on the front of the New York Times, and you have people talking about this issue, and the Pentagon is releasing videos of craft and saying, we don't know what these things are. That is a significant shift in approach, and it's really triggered a big upsurge in interest in this question of UFOs. What are they? What do they represent, and so forth. So we had this interstellar object, then we have this sort of awakening, so to speak, which has kind of been proceeding to today. And there's reasons to be critical of that process. Obviously, there are probably often hidden motives in how these things play out when governments and so forth are involved. But it was significant, and I find it really interesting that we've now got this new interstellar object that's really attracting so much attention, so much consciousness. Human consciousness is directed towards the question of the interstellar, the unknown, the new. And so I'm reading this at minimum. I can't say I know exactly what the visitor is, but I would say that it's at very minimum, it's symbolic of an opening of human consciousness and awareness of our place in the cosmos. That's how I read it. I'd be keen to hear what your thoughts are, Stewart.
Well, I hear you, and I thank you for the context. You've just given us this great perspective of the way that we can look into history, and I called it sort of post-operatively, but retrospectively evaluate. And I feel that what you're saying is fascinating, and I completely cohere. I cohere because really I am a servant to these 12 extraterrestrial beings that are called angels, that are these thoughts of God, these beings of great plasma that, of course, are eternal. They arise out of immortality, so to speak. And they speak of the fact that this celestial visitor is doing exactly what it needs to do, but there is furthermore. They speak of the fact that it is an awakener for us, and it is a harbinger. It is an advent of vast energies that are going to be pouring into planetary consciousness about star nations. So they speak very openly about the way that our planet is being covertly helped, assisted from a vibrational point of view by the Pleiadians, by the Lyran, by the Andromedans, by the Orion, and by Sirius. etc., etc., just as a sort of opening party, as it were, from the Intergalactic Council. They speak of this very, very extraordinarily. And from an astrological point of view, there's another piece of information which they've given me, which is about the planet Riga. Are you familiar at all with Riga?
I'm not.
So what they say is that it will move into the consciousness of planet Earth during March of next year. And it will be seen very specifically above the Giza Plateau. So it will be seen above the Great Pyramid, above the Sphinx. And of course, as we know, the underbelly of that wonderful omphalos, the navel of the world, is moving through a great deal of exploration at the moment, particularly as a result of the Italian scientists applying their SARS testing and discovering the superstructure that lies beneath. So again, what is above is below, what is below is above. So we're seeing something very acute happening here. When the planet vibrates in this position over the Great Pyramid, a force is activated which draws magnetically to the planet a being that is being referred to as being the Blue Lady, who I understand is a Pleiadian high priestess that is going to emerge. Now, the reason why they suggest this is because, as we were sharing earlier in our pre-show chat, that we both have interests. Our destiny calls us to areas of conflict on our planet. And there are some supreme areas of conflict, which many of them which you visited, and I've also visited, primarily within this particular region, as it were, meaning within Europe or within the Middle East. I know you always go into Asia, where you are at the moment, but what they're saying is that the only way that the archetypal conflict that is really at the very core, the very center of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, that this archetypal conflict will be healed by supernatural intervention. So there's a conversation which is going on, which is quite fascinating, about the adherence to our moral prerogative, which is the fact that we're creatures of a planet that is the only planet of choice. So there is that they adhere to this because they are in absolute respect of the principle of free will. And of course, I'm dealing with 12 beings of light that are non-dualistic, which is very, very difficult for many humans to understand. Well, why can't they give me information? Well, they can't give you information because it is within their contract with the divine not to give you information. But what they will do is to stimulate higher vibrational intelligence within you by interacting with you. And there are certain ways that they do this. And one of them is through human emissaries, and I guess that's what I'm all about, of understanding what angelic consciousness means. So that's the level. I mean, there are many other factors, but that's the basic story of what's happening at the moment, that Giza is going to magnetically draw in great shifts. And I know that the work that the angels are doing with me, as I believe you are doing, you are preparing. The angels are preparing us. What you're doing is you're providing us with some very extraordinary cartography, astrological cartography of how we can begin to align our lives with the evident truth of what you speak, because you give us great reason for why we can adhere to the ideas that you share. What I'm doing is, what the angels are doing through me is preparing people from an emotional body point of view, that feeling is the language of the soul. And I know you're also awakening to the vast dimensional interplay between the way that we think and the way that we feel, and the cerebralization, as you were referring to earlier, of the science establishment. You know, that's what I find so fascinating about Avi, that here he is as an establishment figure in that bastion of intellectualization, meaning Harvard, and yet he is outrageous in the way that he's, and when I say outrageous, of course, I mean in a very dramatic point of view. He obviously has a personality that loves to engage in hyperbole. So he steps forward and says all of these daring things without worrying at all about his professional reputation. And I mean, I'm sure behind scenes, his brothers and sisters within the scientific establishment go, oh, and complain about his woo-woo. But at the same time, what's interesting is that so much of the information that he brings forth is then proven to be fact.
Yeah, I think he's doing a really interesting thing because, as you say, we never see a scientist, an academic of that stature saying things like this. It was kind of verboten. And what he's doing is almost kind of moving what you call the Overton window in terms of what is acceptable to say. Because in science for a long time, it's been considered ridiculous to suggest that, say, something like this might be an alien artifact, for example, or an interstellar consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. The assumption always has to be, it's a comet, it's a rock. What are you getting so excited about? And you don't have to go around believing every comet is necessarily, harboring some sort of alien technology or anything like that. But the point is that we need to become open to these possibilities, and he's somehow playing a role of opening minds and shifting what's acceptable to say. I think that's what's really interesting about it, and I do wonder, what's possessed him to do this, because, as you say, there's a lot of attention on him, and probably a lot of his colleagues are saying, what the hell are you doing, man? It's quite interesting to see this figure emerging at this time, and yeah, I do wonder what drives him, really.
Mm-hmm. My perception is that it's passion that drives him, but that he's also a great manager of his personal energies. So he evidently is involved engaged rather in the fascination with narrative, with storytelling. And yet at the same time, it appears that he's grounded in some very profound scientific paradigms. So it feels that it's passion. And actually, psychically, what's interesting is that it's opened up another area of our conversation that I was hoping that you might refer to as what moves you in your fascinated journey into these elements that we're discussing.
Are you speaking specifically of the UFO phenomenon, or astrology, or?
Well, all of it, because you have a way of being able to sort of hold the portmanteau, all the very, because you're fascinated in so many different things. But the wonderful thing about you is that you interlink them because they matter to you. You see the purpose of what the relationships are all about, that nothing is separate, where it's all interwoven, interlinked.
Yes, I think that's really what fascinated me and hooked me to astrology. And honestly speaking, before I was drawn to it, I felt a little bit lost in certain ways. And, I wasn't somebody who grew up with the kind of experiences that you've clearly had. I, for a long time, had even though when I was a boy, I was interested in all this sort of stuff. You kind of have that drummed out of you in school. And I spent most of my adult life not really believing in these kinds of things, and felt a bit lost in terms of purpose and just the chaos of the world. Like, what is all this for? Why is all this happening? I found it quite depressing when I felt that I was living in a cosmos without purpose, and that's that's what people are taught to believe, that it's all just kind of chaotic happenstance as a result of immutable laws of physics, and atoms crashing into each other, and that results in this. And that, even though I didn't really have an alternative, I think that didn't satisfy me. And for me, the idea that there is purpose to historical events and to the evolution of humanity is just incredibly compelling. So what I've been drawn to doing in my astrological work is studying different cycles and the impulses that they represent. That you see different impulses kind of coming into the world, and then meeting the reaction of the world, and maybe being resisted, maybe mutating along the way. But this kind of perspective of purpose, which is what astrology really gives you, it gives you this perspective that things have a purpose, that there is meaning to events. And I'm just fascinated by the quest for meaning. Essentially, I want to understand. When I'm looking at things, I'm trying to think what is the what ultimate impulse is this coming from? And I like to look back in history and trace processes and try to put things in context and understand, again, process and the bigger picture. And that's been so comforting for me personally in terms of my own worldview and general sense of comfort in this world, that I want to share it. I want other people to experience that. And that's really my ultimate mission in what I do. And I almost suspect that I was kept away from this world for a long time because I needed to learn to speak a language that people who are more skeptical could would maybe find credible. I think lots of people speak to different kind of groups of people. They speak to different audiences. People in our space are here to maybe to speak to different groups of kinds of people. And I think one of the things that I'm maybe meant to do is to speak to some of the people that are a bit more skeptical, a bit more on the fence about the reality of this kind of stuff. And because I spent so much time just kind of in the quote unquote straight world, I know how to speak in ways that seem credible to them. And it's not to throw any shade on people who are much more intuitive or are deep into the quote unquote woo woo and that, those, we all are playing our role and speaking to different people. So that's kind of how I see what I do and what I'm here to do.
That's beautiful. And you obviously have a quest for freedom. Hence, you being drawn into war-torn situations, nations that are torn apart by war, that there is a quest for freedom. Is that agreeable or disagreeable?
I was always, I became really motivated to explore the world, and that was a big driver in what I was doing. And I always felt like, you need to do something of some kind of positive use for humanity. And for most of the work that I've done you could put in that kind of frame. I'm no saint or anything. It's just what I was drawn to in my working life. But freedom is really important to me as a value. And I think it's something that guides me in terms of how I see the world now. And in terms of looking at what's going on in the world and the geopolitical strife, the political strife, I'm thinking often kind of what's the outcome that's going to ensure that kind of human freedom flourishes. That what worries me in the world is the prospect of losing freedom, and of, we've seen some really terrible examples of totalitarianism in the 20th century. And what sort of, if I was to say I had any fears, it's that we have technology now that can be harnessed to kind of create control systems and so forth. And there is an impulse towards creating those, but also a big impulse against them. A lot of people see the problems with some of these things. I certainly do, but a lot of people do. And so, it's not, I'm not saying that that's where things are going, but for me, it's important that we kind of keep the importance of freedom in mind as we're thinking about particularly where technology is taking us.
I think that's fascinating. I personally, it's right up my street. I cohere with all that you're saying, and then move into the themes of the world that we're living in, which is tumbling further and further and further on surface levels into chaos as a result of, it seems, pretty ridiculous choices being made by the so-called change makers, our leaders. And that I feel that, just to bring back Three Eye Atlas, what Three Eye Atlas does is to startle us because its behavior is so unusual for a comet, which etymologically speaking means a celestial visitor. So it already has an element of the fact that there is something supernal about it. There's something unusual, there's something preternatural, there's something supernatural. It's just that we think comet, we think automatically of this lump of matter hurtling through space, which after all is what the whole of our planetary organization was subsumed beneath when Isaac Newton in the early part of the 17th century said the planet is merely a lump of matter hurtling through space. It doesn't have a soul. And we withdrew from the fundamental belief that it existed for over 1,000 years and further within indigenous peoples. But I'm just thinking about civilized communities, so-called civilized communities, that there was a great belief in the fact that the anima mundi was alive within everything. Well, if you say that the planet is merely a lump of matter hurtling through space, then automatically you desacralize Mother Nature. And that's, I feel that one of the great messages that AI Atlas is helping us with, this is not a new conversation as we know, but it's an amplification of the conversation that we're having about we need to get serious about our planet, and therefore we need to get serious about the earth within us. How are we operating physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually? Are we asking the most appropriate questions and recognizing that we actually have huge power in the way that we make choices to align or not align with, to align with the positivism and not to align with the negativity in very broad terms.
Yeah.
So all that you speak of is really about the Renaissance man, and I feel that this is or the Renaissance person, the Renaissance woman. I feel that so much of what you say is about bringing together all of the fascinating degrees that have awakened within your own consciousness, that are some of the most tantalizing principles that we need to awaken to save the destruction of Western Enlightenment, which has as its very core the sanctity of the individual.
Right. And one of the things that was coming to mind to me just as you were speaking there is just to think about Three Eye Atlas again. One thing that an astrologer learns very quickly is that names are important. If you look at asteroid astrology, you'll find some really strange things happen when you look at asteroids. There are 26,000 named asteroids now. And if you look at where they are in your natal chart, you'll find some really weird things. Sometimes, for example, my mother's name is within 1 degree. It's very tightly conjunct the IC of my chart. That's a part of the chart that speaks to home, family, where you come from, parents, and all sorts of spooky things like that. And so this kind of thing, asteroid astrology, points to very weird aspects of reality, but names are important. If we somehow give a name to an object, and we find that it's actually connected to our lives, it's almost like we discover the name. We don't give it the name, we discover it. And so you have to think about the name of Three Eye Atlas there. And somebody, I didn't come up with this. Somebody in my one of the comments under my YouTube video pointed out, well, Three Eye, that's the third eye. Right? We have the third eye in the name, and we have Atlas who held up the world. So the name does seem to speak to sort of awakening about the planet. It's almost right there. And again, as an astrologer, you can't ignore that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's meaningful.
Yeah. Oh, it's crucial, absolutely crucial, because that's why we name things, isn't it? And once we name things, the entity has an identity. And that's a massive minefield of, we take it so for granted, but actually naming is crucial, as we see at the beginning of Genesis. And God said to Adam, go into the garden and name everything. So there is the emergence of the divine logos, which is one of the areas that the angels propagate through me. So they've also talked about this. They've also talked about Atlas. And the interesting thing is that Atlas, as as a slice, if you like, of sound, a sound bite of divine logos, was the name of the father god of Atlantis, Atlantis, they who came from the sea, they who came from the waters. So we know that at this time we're going through a reemergence of interest in the intelligence of Atlantis and how evidently something towards the latter part of its destiny went wrong, and that possibly there is a mirroring or a parallel between what happened then, which is essentially 20, 25, 20, 15,000 years ago, and what's actually happening on our planet today to do with the dysfunction of central government. What was also interesting is that we were living a different level of consciousness then, because we didn't have 44 sleeping aspects of our DNA, or that we were really open to, at least, if we're living a double helix now, they were living 5, 6, 7 helix. Whereas the planetary energies were becoming heavier and heavier and heavier. So we were losing the potentiality of what that high level force is all about. So there are many, many resonances here. And in fact, there was something that they said that intrigued me that I thought we could play with. And this is right at the end of the last week's channeling, that the angel said that Atlas visits in order for you to see how you may navigate the next 7 years as a micro value within eternity. And therefore Atlas is not above you, it is within you, dear ones. For you had asked, we angels, what Atlas is, and we say to you, to complete this transmission, it is the organic Atlas of your highest ideals. Goosebumps. Fascinating principle.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting as well, the 7 years that you mentioned there. This a lot of people are pointing to this kind of period of 2026 to 2032 as being really significant and sort of perhaps constituting a real kind of moment of truth for humanity. And I've been studying a particular planetary cycle, the Pluto-Neptune synodic cycle, which is a 500-year cycle. And it's very powerful. It's kind of like the sort of bass notes of history, these kind of really deep trends of things. And that cycle, those two planets are going to be an aspect, making exact sextile aspects between 2026 and 2032. And essentially capping off about a century of a sort of process of development that's lasted about 100 years, and which really began in the 1940s. What's also interesting about this cycle is it began in the 1890s, and around this time, we started to become much more conscious of Atlantis and what happened to it. This was the time of Ignatius Donnelly's book on Atlantis. Madame Blavatsky was talking about Atlantis. All the theosophists were talking about Atlantis. And this sort of idea really returns to consciousness at that time. And again, the cycle began at that time. The 1890s is really crucial to understand our current times. So there's something about the rediscovery of that information which is baked into the cycle that we're living through. And what's really interesting, you mentioned the pyramids, and you mentioned what's going on in Giza. We have two planets, very powerful outer planets, Uranus and Pluto. Uranus is in Gemini, Pluto is in Aquarius. These are both air signs. They're connected with knowledge and information and connection. Now, Pluto is the lord of the underworld, and it tends to awaken from below. It tends to sort of signify things that emerge sort of powerfully from beneath the surface. Uranus, or Uranus, is the sky god, and Uranus awakens from above. And these two planets are in this very close aspect at the moment. They're speaking to each other. They're from the air signs. So we're getting awakening from above and below. And you mentioned this work in Giza by the Italian researchers, which uses satellite techniques. It uses satellite information to uncover what's below. Right, we have above and below there. It's quite spooky almost. But what's interesting about this is that there is this process of, I think, awakening to our true history, which has obviously been suppressed. And that also, by extension, involves an awakening to the intelligences of the cosmos as well. And so those things are happening at the same time at this crucial period of history. And the next 7 years probably is when it's all coming out and things are going to be changing dramatically.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Because we can see that right in the very core of all that you're suggesting, all that we're sharing, that there is this latitude of intelligence that is opening, where we begin to really examine in a very grounded, in a very sensible way, the nature of the vastness of our potential. Because we can begin to feel that it's safe to explore all of the multidimensionality of what you're suggesting without castigating it with terms like, oh, that's scary, or that's really weird, or that's just woo-woo, and we've dismissed it. In fact, David Hamilton, I don't know if you know David's work. He's been a friend of mine for a long time. He's just written a book for Hay House called oh God, I can't remember what it's called, but it's something. It's all about dispensing woo-woo, and from being the scientist that he is, that his job is also to measure, particularly from the endocrinological system of our bodies, how we can begin to open ourselves to appreciate that there's more in this world, Horatio, than you've dreamed of in your philosophy. So stop being so damning. I've been very not outrageous, but I've been very open, that's too mild a word. I've allowed the drama of my being. I feel things in very volcanic fashion. I'm a Taurus, so I can speak of the earth churning, about the nature of what the angels are suggesting, or indeed what they awaken in my own perception about Three-Eye Atlas. And we know that Three-Eye Atlas is the space station in Chile, where the telescope first saw this extraordinary mass moving towards us. But at the same time, the synchronicities are so great. Anyway, I've never received such criticism from people, because there was something this morning through social media that said, you don't know what you're talking about, even though I've been actually talking to someone that I know who is in NASA, who always gives me a lot of really spicy information that supports what's happening on a very intuitive level. Because although I've been able over the years to find a balance between left and right, as a younger person, my left brain was completely not awake. I was completely feeling based and dancing with fairies and angels, which of course worried my caregivers and caretakers in the most extraordinary way. Couldn't read, couldn't do math, etc., etc. And in the post-war years, when I was born, that was a problem. That was a big problem. So there was a tremendous amount of castigation, of humiliation, of beatings, of punishment, and dismissal. Whereas I have a brother who's a year older, who was intellectually brilliant, but not as smart about his emotions. And now in his senior years of life, he's sorting out what that's all about. However, so we're all on this remarkable journey at a time, it seems, through the chronology of what you're describing to us, that is deduced from the great purpose of the way that we see these vast spheres moving, that there's a huge truth that is being born. And it sort of I feel constantly as though watch this space, that the space is opening up in the most extraordinary way. So it becomes more liberal. and that this is maybe what the messenger Avi is all about, because it's only, well, I suppose it's now 10 years ago that, for example, Rupert Sheldrake, who I admire enormously, you're familiar with Rupert's work, Rupert
I
Sheldrake,
am,
the
yes.
biologist, who brought us the notion of the morphogenetic field. But he did a TED talk, and when Rupert speaks, he speaks with such lucidity. He's so intelligent and wise, the way that he's able to use language to sculpt reason from all sorts of interesting areas of the biological consciousness of our planet, and to read it through a metaphysical perspective. He has a lens which is dependent on very deep devotion and faith in the divine. And yet the talk that he gave for TED was banned. The talk that I gave for TED was banned. And the people who asked me, who'd organized it, had to fight with the TED people. Eventually, I thought it was so awful, I removed it. But, it's interesting that here we are, part of our journey, because I believe that Rupert and I are indigos, so that we're here to upset the system. It's something that I've always done. And surprise, 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 for you to hear, astrologically speaking, that Saturn is diametrically opposed to my sun in Taurus. And so Big Daddy is a big issue. That seems to be changing, though, as I move through my 70s. That seems to be changing, which is interesting.
Are you embodying that energy yourself now?
Well, I burned off the karma. So, yeah, I feel that my seniority brings me to a position of gravitas, where I need to firstly assure myself and the divine that I'm living through truth and credence. But then I need to step forward and speak. So I'm allowing that to happen. Whereas earlier on in life, I would have been fearful of upsetting someone, or of upsetting a system so much that I would get it in the neck, because systems have often disagreed with me, shall we say, and therefore have been very punitive in the punishment. One which was really the zenith of my career in the entertainment industry that I walked away from in 2010. And it's the only job that I walked away from in disgrace. So that was a huge learning curve of how our destiny allows us, if we're awake, to unravel the significance of all the substrata within us, going deep into our unconscious. So I've always been very lofty with the heavens and with the magical beings of the heavens, and how I could be transported by language, which is what my fascination in the Romantic poets were all about, that led me into my utter belief in the fact that Shakespeare was seeing something completely different from what many intelligent people are seeing, and was able to at that time, which was interesting because it was also that time that you were just exploring from a Plutonic point of view. That, going all the way back into that early part, 500 years ago, of the early part of the Tudor period, that then brought us to the governance of Elizabeth, and the great changes that took place in sense of the expansion of the British Empire, and the fact that London was London was seen as the Earth Star chakra of the world because of the power of what's underneath St. Paul's Cathedral, built on Lud's Hill, and the power of Lud as the Celtic god presence. So I'm very involved in the conversation around all of that power centering. And what's interesting is that my life has drawn me to be a witness to all these things. For example, my dad worked for the royal family, so I was steeped in all of that, watching very powerful people be powerful in very judicious ways, but not feeling powerful myself. And the destiny of my karma has been burned off recently because of working with a very principled individual within British establishment. And so being able to interface with that individual and not be repudiated or not being denounced, has been very interesting. And also the fact that I was actually really proud of myself of just carrying the metal of what the interior process within oneself is all about. Can I do this job, or am I going to make a fuck up of it? Am I going to say something inappropriate, or is my behavior going to be too emotional? Because people always in establishment always say, "Oh, for God's sake, you're so emotional. Just put it away. What is all this emotional intelligence that you keep talking about?" So what is your aspiration? And when I say that, I know that you have many aspirations, but at least that's what I read. But in terms of the responsibility that we have to the community, what is your aspiration as you perceive the astrological lens in the way that you do? What would you like us all to move towards?
What I'm trying to stoke in my audience and to people who are interested in my work is actually the same thing that was stoked in me, just a belief and a faith in purpose, and a conviction that our lives are fundamentally meaningful and valuable. And so if I can help anybody who watches my work who maybe struggles with that belief sometimes, if I can help any of them towards that, then I'll feel very happy and like my work has been successful.
Oh, that's so noble. You're amazing. You're so noble. I want to support you in that. I think it's amazing. You're going to say something.
I mean, this is what this is the kind of, you have to have a mission that drives you, and I'm also motivated by very mundane concerns as well. I don't consider myself an enormously noble person, really, but that was really the impulse that kind of made me want to start sharing about astrology. It really helped me, and I'd like it to help others as well.
Do you know it's in the speech that Hamlet gives, "What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals." That's what I mean by noble. That's a definition of the noble mind through the Elizabethan perspective, borrowed from Leonardo da Vinci, because there are 7 clauses there that measure the 7 aspects of embodying the human nature. And noble being high-minded, because you are a pioneer in your own unique way of bringing us truth and bringing us freedom and bringing us liberation through the gentleness that you also bring to the world. So I thank you for that. Thank you for your contribution.
That's very kind of you, and I thank you for those words.
It's true. It's true. I hold great. There's one more question I just want to ask you, but I hold great enjoyment in watching the aspirational flow of your career, as it were, because I feel that you're onto something really extraordinary. For the reasons that you've given us, but this ability, just to annotate them further, this ability that you have to read the science of astrology, but then to use a linguistic that is just so beautifully real and earthy and sensible, so that it's demystified.
Well, I am a Taurus rising, so maybe that's maybe that's part of what I'm about. Like I said earlier, I want to. I feel like I was kept away from this stuff for a long time, so that I could learn to speak in a plain but kind of way that people who've been steeped in the sort of more materialist perspective can relate to and can understand.
Yeah. What galvanizes your faith?
My faith is galvanized every day when I do my work, because you constantly see this reflection between above and below. The astrology is an incredibly fascinating art, and you're met with little miracles every day, honestly, when you're reading somebody's chart and you see that you help them to see that they have been living through an archetype which is very prominent in their natal chart, for example, or all the kind of miracles that happen with astrology when you're able to say back predict when something important happened to somebody, and that's a really miraculous thing for them, and then just following the astrology myself, following how world events and things that we see in the news are following the symbols in the sky, just seeing that, and especially when it's a really kind of powerful signal and a powerful hit, so to speak, those kind of things always galvanize my faith.
Bless you. Thank you so much for all that you've shared with us. Unfortunately, our time has reached a point of completion, but thank you. And I hope that, well, we'll talk about it, but I hope that you felt easy with the discourse that we engage in, because I'd love you to come back and give us a perspective next year on the developments that we've been through.
I would be very glad to, Stuart. It's been a lot of fun, this conversation, and I felt it. Yeah, it's been very easy, and I think we're speaking about a lot of the same things in our work. So I'd be delighted to come back next year. Absolutely.
Yeah, and now I know why, because you have Taurus rising. Where's your sun?
Leo. And a Gemini moon, lots of Gemini placements. So the communication is perhaps what I'm here to do.
Yeah. My moon is also Gemini, but my rising sign is Sagittarius. Yeah, there's something very extraordinary within your soul that I recognize. That I have a feeling that we've met before, but not in this life. So bless you. Thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's been an engaging, I'm sure it has, because we've spoken about so many different things, and in a very grounded and very purposeful way. So bless you for tuning in. And if you need to go to Dan, I want you to, Ryan, could you put out Dan's website, please? World Astrology Report Substack, and then World Astrology Report YouTube, and worldastrologyreport.com. Do you have it, Ryan? For those of you who are wondering, Ryan is my manager, my tech manager, who's hovering in the background. There we are. Thank you, Ryan. So go straight to this zone, because obviously Dan is always open for the consideration of your birth charts. And as you see, he has an extraordinary intelligence and intuitive knowledge about how to balance all the ingredients of reading great astrology. Bless you. Thank you for your humanity. Please stay where you are. But everybody else, namaste, namaste, namaste.